Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I'm here to do a discussion of the book Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements by Charlene A. Carruthers. This is a book that I read for my Social Justice Nonfiction project. I'll link a video about that below if you're curious. And I just wanted to talk about some of the ideas that this book brings forward. Charlene A. Carruthers is somebody who was a leader of the Black Youth Project 100. I have a link to that below if you're curious as well. And in this book, she talks about two main things. The first is how to have an intersectional lens to social justice work. And the second is how to go about organizing movements that really fight for radical change. So first, let me talk about the social justice lens that Carruthers is advocating for. One part of this is the intersectionality of that social justice work. So Carruthers is making this argument that we should have a Black, queer, feminist approach because when we have intersections of marginalized identities, these are the people who really have the most to say about what needs to change in the system because they're getting those kinds of oppressions from multiple different angles, and we should be advocating for systemic changes with that lens in mind. So we should be thinking about intersectionality. We should be thinking about how various people of various marginalizations are affected, how their intersections are affected, and making sure that it's not just movements that advocate for liberation and better circumstances for some, but really for all, and that we're not going to reach truly a liberated state for all of society unless we make sure that all of society is included. So she makes some very strong arguments about why an intersectional approach is so important and how throughout history intersectional identities have been very prevalent in a lot of movement work, but often they are ignored or sidelined because it doesn't fit with the narrative that many people want to tell. She argues that really that is the narrative that we should be telling, we should be remembering that, and she makes some pretty good arguments for this. Another aspect to the social justice lens that she argues for is that of radical Black imagination. So the idea of Black imagination is to create wholly new ideas, wholly new futures. Because we have grown up in Western societies, we have basically been exposed to a lot of systemic injustices, a lot of capitalism and colonialism and anti-Blackness that has permeated the way that we view the world. And there's this idea of decolonizing your mind where you read up, you try to understand what ways capitalism, colonialism, etc. has influenced the way you look at things and try to find a new way to look at things. Try to get yourself out of that mindset, that worldview, to see new possibilities. So the first part of this is that decolonization, and then the second part is imagination. So imagination is really important and has been done throughout history. There's a term called freedom dreaming, which is something that enslaved peoples would do, where you dream of a future where you are free and you have the rights that you should have. And that dreaming, that imagining of a better future is very important, because if you stick just within what you already know, it's very difficult to come up with ideas of how you could change the future or why you should even try. It's much easier to just survive with the status quo without challenging those systems. So Black imagination, and radical Black imagination in particular, is very important in the social justice approach because it's what allows you to be creative and think of completely different alternatives to the current system. There's a great quote that she includes by Audre Lorde, which is, "We cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house." And it's that idea that if you allow yourself to be held back by these systems and only think of small little reforms that you would make rather than big systemic changes, you're never going to be able to create a wholly new experience. And so that imagination and dreaming of radical new futures is key. The second part of Carruthers' book focuses on how to structure community organizing, how to create movements. This is the part that I maybe didn't understand as well. I'm not as familiar with community organizing, so I think a lot of this went over my head, but I will talk about the parts that I did understand. And if you're somebody who is familiar with community organizing or movements, I really recommend that you take a look at what Carruthers has to say and see if it can be something useful for you, because it seemed like there was a lot of good information there. So one of the aspects of creating strong community movements that Carruthers talks about is that of creating a community of leaders. She talks about how often it's so easy to just lionize a single person and try to make a movement around just one charismatic individual, but how that's really not effective, because if that individual is no longer involved, the movement kind of falls apart. And it also doesn't allow for the movement to grow and evolve and change with new generations. So she argues that for community movements, they should be constantly bringing in new people and training them as leaders and getting their thoughts. And this is also an important part of intersectionality. You need to have so many different people with so many different backgrounds adding their voice, contributing, and giving direction to the movement. She talks about how there have been so many people in the past who've been involved, and it's important that we remember them and that we tell their stories and that we encourage new people to be part of it, and that we tell that story of the movement as a community so that other people know that they can contribute, they can join. They don't have to be some, perfect charismatic leader in order to make a difference. Another big aspect that she talks about for community organizing is really questioning yourself and your relationship to the movement to understand truly how you are invested. She argues that everybody has something at stake. And if you don't know what you have at stake, it's very hard to remain invested. It's very hard to devote yourself to what you're trying to accomplish if you don't see what you have to lose or gain. And similarly, it's important to understand what your investment is in various communities and the fights that other people are doing. If you don't understand how you're connected to them and how your future is tied to their future, it's going to be very hard for you to stand up when you should to fight for their rights as well, because you won't see it as your rights, you'll see it as their rights. And that's not enough. You need to understand the connections, to be invested in the struggle, and to just understand how you fit into the puzzle and what the movement means to you in order to not burn out and not become disinvested. Also, I do want to mention that Carruthers talks quite a bit about her experiences with the Black Youth Project 100 and specific things that they did. A lot of this is history that I'm not as familiar with, but there were many cool examples in here of what kind of work they did. One of the ones that really stands out is that they worked with a bunch of other organizations in Chicago to fight for reparations for a bunch of people who, I believe in the 80s, were imprisoned and sort of tortured and brutalized by police. They fought for these reparations and they won, and it was apparently the first municipality in the US to ever win reparations for racially motivated police brutality. And they got a lot of cool things that happened, not just counseling for the people who were affected, but also things like public apology and a memorial and a history lesson added into the schools about that episode. And it's just really interesting the ways that they have fought for various things. So if you're interested in that kind of community organizing aspect, there's quite a bit in there about it. Okay, so those were the main ideas that at least I was able to understand in this book. I think that there's a lot of really great content. The parts of this book that really made sense to me were the social justice lens one. I'd already been familiar with some of those ideas before that I've been reading about over the past couple of years, but the community organizing bit was a little newer to me. If you're somebody who's already familiar with this topic, I think this is probably a very good book to pick up. But even if you're somebody who is newer to the topic and you just want to get involved in it, but maybe are intimidated by this, I think a really good thing to do is just to read other are easier to enter books. So for example, people's memoirs or fiction that has these themes. So I wanted to recommend a couple of books that I have read in the past couple of years that I saw many of the themes and ideas that Carruthers talked about present. So first, let me mention some memoirs and essay collections. I think that Becoming by Michelle Obama is a great read for a ton of reasons, but also because she grew up as a Black woman in Chicago, and she and Barack Obama were involved in a lot of community organizing type efforts. So I think that that is a great book to pick up if you want something very mainstream that still has these themes. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates has a book called Between the World and Me, which similarly is a memoir, but really talks about his experiences growing up as a Black boy in the inner city. And it talks a lot about how that has affected his worldview. So that was really good. If you want something that is a little bit lighter, but still packs a punch, I really like Phoebe Robinson's audiobooks. She has 2 essay collections, the first of which is called You Can't Touch My Hair. The second is called Everything's Trash, But It's Okay. And both of these are her commentary on a lot of things going on in her life and society, but it really comes at it from a social justice lens, and in particular, a Black feminist lens. So I think these are great introductions to a lot of these topics and really also just fun to listen to. Next, I'd like to recommend some fiction books that have these themes as well. First, there's a couple of books by Jemisin Reynolds that I think are excellent. One is Long Way Down, which is a YA contemporary told in verse about a Black teenager whose older brother is killed in some gang violence and he's trying to decide what to do. I think that that takes on a lot of this idea of the cycles of violence and of what the community means and your connections to it. Also, he has a series called the Track series, and the first book in that is Ghost. I think this is really excellent in understanding some of these generational traumas, some of these issues of being a Black kid and the anger that you feel. So there's a lot in both of these books that really gives insight into the experience of Black kids in the US. Another author who I think has excellent themes of social justice and sort of fighting for better futures is N.K. Jemisin. N.K. Jemisin does a lot of kind of science fiction and fantasy speculative fiction. She has the Broken Earth trilogy, which starts with the 5th season. That is such an excellent series. It won the Hugo Award for each book in the series, in the trilogy. And it not only is just excellent fiction, but it really talks about creating huge systemic changes and imagining a completely new future. Similarly, her collection How Long Till Black Future Month, which is a bunch of short stories that are speculative fiction, has many different themes of social justice and many explorations of different ways that you can create better futures. So I love both of those. Similarly, another author that explores these themes of social justice and creating systemic changes is Rivers Solomon. Rivers Solomon has 2 books, An Unkindness of Ghosts and The Deep. An Unkindness of Ghosts is a science fiction about a generational starship that is basically set up like the antebellum South. And in this book, it really follows the process of uncovering the systemic issues and fighting against them, trying to create a better system. And it comes from a very intersectional lens because the main character is Black, queer, and just fights for a lot of things that are not easy to fight for. In The Deep, this is sort of a more fantasy type speculative fiction that imagines there are mer people who are the descendants of pregnant women who were captured by slavers and thrown overboard, and they have a lot of issues with generational trauma and how to share that as a community that I think really resonate with a lot of the themes talked about by Carruthers in Unapologetic. One other thing that I wanted to mention as an alternative to getting into this topic of social justice and this Black queer feminist lens is to just subscribe to more booktubers who take that lens, who talk about things from that perspective. I have a shout outs video that I did a while back. I will link that below, talking about different booktubers who focus on social justice themes. But in particular, Njeri at ONYX Pages definitely talks about this theme a lot. And she has a video from about a year ago where she talks about, in particular, that kind of use of speculative fiction and Black radical imagination in order to create political movement and better futures. So I highly recommend that video, and I will link it below. Okay, so that concludes my discussion of Unapologetic by Charlene A. Carruthers. If anybody has read this book and has more thoughts to add, please leave them in the comments below. Or if you have other recommendations for books on this topic, or if you've read any of the other books that I've mentioned, or you just have comments in general, I'd love to hear them below, so go ahead and let me know.